Thank you. All right, let's jump in. So, quick poll. Who has been at the previous sessions here on this stage with Justin Gillis from the New York Times, Tony Dokoupil from previously MSNBC, now CBS News, Eric Roston from Bloomberg News, and Catherine Keating from Vice News? A few of you? All right, good. So this is the third in this ongoing conversation where I try to bring storytellers from the press generally to talk about the issues of the day around climate change, clean energy, sustainable development, etc. So I am beyond thrilled that this panel is here for a variety of reasons. One, I've worked with Valerie and John for several years now. Valerie came up from DC for this panel, where she's normally based, with Reuters as a correspondent covering these issues, climate change, clean energy, etc. John Sutter came from Atlanta, where CNN's headquarters are. He flew up this morning, he's flying back after the panel. And Ambassador Jumeau, I'm thrilled he's on the panel because we're going to talk about small island developing states and the impact of climate change on his country, Seychelles. He's now the permanent representative to the UN. So he is not only an incredible messenger on this issue, he's got the legitimacy and authority because he's speaking about the very issues that will impact his small island state. So what an incredible panel. Valerie, John, Ambassador, I'm thrilled you're here. And I'm just going to jump into a conversation. It's going to be very conversational, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with the audience. But rather than kind of pomp and circumstance and stand deliver, let's just have a big conversation. So this week has been an incredible week. Although I have to say, watching all the comedians, Stephen Colbert, John Oliver, Samantha Bee, every week seems like an incredible week when it comes to the assault on climate action and climate policy. But I just want to frame this conversation within the context of this week. So this past weekend, 49 climate vulnerable countries made a plea to the G20 saying, we want you to end fossil fuel subsidies by hopefully 2020. So that's the 49 most vulnerable countries that will be impacted by climate change, Seychelles certainly being one of them, making a plea to the G20 and fossil fuel subsidies. Anyone know what the total fossil fuel subsidies are globally? Those of you who took my class should know this figure. Yes?
5 trillion?
Yes, 5.3 trillion, IMF. So that's what these climate vulnerable countries said. We want you to end those subsidies. Some are direct, some are indirect, cleanup of pollution, etc., healthcare. This Thursday, tomorrow, there's going to be a conversation that Trump is having with his team about whether or not to be in the Paris Agreement, stay in the Paris Agreement, renegotiate the Paris Agreement. Rick Perry, who's the Secretary of Energy for the US government, has said, well, we should stay in, but let's renegotiate it. Other people like Secretary Tillerson and certainly Ambassador Haley have said, well, we should be a part of it. But that is happening tomorrow. It was going to happen last week, but now it's happening tomorrow. I'm curious your thoughts if you've got some inside sources on what's going to be said. Also tomorrow, the House Sustainable Energy Environment Coalition, for whom Ambassador Jumeau has spoken on the Hill. They're a great ally and great resource in this conversation. They're having a big press conference on climate justice, which is very relevant to this. So expect that tomorrow. Hopefully they say some courageous and cutting edge things. And then this weekend, what's happening this weekend on Saturday? Climate March, Global Climate March. So Washington is hitting heat records for April, and this weekend is potentially going to surpass previous, I think it's going to be the second hottest day in April for Washington, D.C. So it's appropriate that the Climate March is going to be happening on one of the hottest days, in one of the hottest months in Washington, D.C. So to set this conversation tonight in that context, I just want to frame what's happening, what's going to be happening. I just want to do a quick litany on what Trump and his administration have attacked. I don't think that's too harsh a word. Not a word that they might use, but I'll use it for them. I've got a list of 10. Waters, unprotected. What can mining companies now do with their waste? Correct. Paris, potentially renegotiated. 2. Climate and science language, what has happened to it on administration sites? Disappeared, scrubbed, potentially entirely, they can't use the language. 4, the pesticide, chlorpyrifos. What can we now do? What could we do previously, but what can we continue to do with the pesticide, which often ends up in your food? Any ideas now? So there's no ban on it, and it can continue to be in your food. Coal leases on federal lands. This is something Valerie has written on in terms of coal country, Kentucky, etc. Now we're going to be seeking more coal on federal lands. rescinding the Clean Power Plan. That was the plan under the previous administration, under Barack Obama's administration. We're going to walk back the tracking of CO2 emissions. Dakota and Keystone pipelines, what happened to them? Resumed, we got the green light. Vehicle fuel efficiency standards, what's happening to them? Rolling back some of those standards. Also Energy Star appliances. And lastly, EPA, most importantly, NOAA budgets. What are happening to their budgets? Okay, so that's a pretty formidable state of affairs. And when Valerie said to me, what should I talk about? One of my responses was, well, what gives you hope? Because we know the state of affairs are going to be impacting, because the US is one of the biggest carbon emitters, and when the US leads, the rest of the world can potentially follow. The ambassador has often said that you've talked about New York City, and you try to bring it home as often as possible in your messaging, making it relevant here in New York City in terms of how sea level rise and climate change will impact New York City. So he too is using messaging that will have US impacts, not just Seychelles impacts. So we know the state of affairs are serious. What gives us hope? What is the way forward? That's what I'm going to be most interested in. And I want to start with you, Ambassador, because you have been pounding this pavement persistently and patiently and powerfully and positively. And I know you spent time in Congress pounding the pavement there. From your perspective, one, the severity, which we know, and John Sutter has been to Marshall Islands to document, if you've ever seen John Sutter's work with CNN, went to the Marshall Islands to document some of the sea level rise, potential problems there. But Ambassador, one, the severity of the situation, but pivoting quickly to what gives you hope as you're communicating with the Alliance of the Small Island States and you're mingling with like-minded messengers, where is, in your mind, the most optimistic way forward, given kind of this litany of potential problems we have with the U.S. administration?
Thank you. It is a very interesting time for us, because what we're looking for now is we're not letting all the noise about Trump deafen us as to the realities of what's happening in the U.S. We're reading the reports that whatever Trump does, or whatever the U.S. administration does, the shift to a cleaner economy is going to continue. The four biggest producers of wind power in the United States are 4 Republican states that voted for Trump. And one interesting thing that has happened, it has sort of lifted a veil that US action on climate change is not about the government. It's about the private sector, it's about the cities, it's about the states, it's about academia, civil society, the philanthropic bodies, where there's billions of dollars which they're trying to find a way to feed into the process, especially through the SDG process, the Sustainable Development Goals process. And just to give you an example, I am a vice chair of the board of a partnership called the Global Island Partnership, which includes Hawaii, includes British Virgin Islands, not just independent states. And yesterday I was someone from Hawaii, and they're incensed that Hawaii was described as an island in the Pacific by the Attorney General. And so they said, now we're not thinking just as Americans, we're thinking as islanders. We'll show them what an island is. And she said to me, how can we work together? So what has happened, instead of making us depressed and saying, oh, woe is me, what's happening because of the US administration, it's opening up other avenues with people on the ground who can actually make a difference. Yes, we would like the US to stay in the Paris Agreement. Yes, we need them at the table. But what is happening? You're seeing China step forward. There's talks maybe of an alliance between the European Union on China once the EU sorts out its political problems, because we're not too sure where they're headed. The French election will have given an indication. But there's a realigning of forces. If there's one thing islands are famous for, is resilience. We are the ones who are battered by hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, whatever you call them, whatever part of the world you are. So we are out there looking for innovative solutions. Seychelles, for example, through the blue economy, we've done recently, we did a debt swap with the Paris Club and South Africa, bringing what is a basic country with an annex one group to help us raise funds to create marine parks so as to strengthen the resilience of oceans. We're working with the World Bank and the Green Global Environment Facility to launch the world's first blue bonds. Part of the blue bonds will be given to a new trust we formed for the debt swap. Our partner in the debt swap is TNC, the Nature Conservancy, the biggest environmental organization within the US. And Nature Conservancy brought to the table other philanthropic bodies like the Wade Foundation, Ocean Spire. Leonardo DiCaprio gave us $5 million for our debt swap. And we're finding other partners who are willing to step forward and saying, look, I know the situation with the country, the government isn't rosy, but don't be blinded by that. Because even as a government, we need emissions cuts from the US, yes. But the reality of the situation is we need emissions cuts from China and India. The US can cut only so far. It will level out. Same with the EU. But we need them to the table to do that. But because we can't get the emissions, we need the support, financial, technological, human resources support for us to prepare for the consequences of a Paris Agreement without the US, or a Paris Agreement with the US but dragging its feet, not committing, not that sort of thing. A lot has been talked about. The US is going, even if it's in the Paris Agreement, it's going to cut funding like the Green Climate Fund. I'm an alternate member of the Green Climate Fund board. But we have foreseen that. So you're not hearing a lot of kicking and screaming from the islanders. It's like we're negotiating like in a movie where someone's driving down the wrong way street. We're just trying to negotiate and say, oh, that one's gone, so forget about them for the money. Where else can we go? So it's forcing us to be innovative, to be creative, and to refuse to be discouraged by what any country says. After all we have to lose are our homes. You can't discourage us more than that.
So you've expected to work around and are pursuing that, and it sounds like a lot is blooming in the void of US leadership. When you think about where to spend your time and energy and your messaging, do you now just ignore DC entirely? Or, I've noticed you will often lead with people-centered, health-centered messaging, and your point about saving SID, small island developing states, will also save New York City. So you're trying to put the person in that conversation versus coral, which in Seychelles, latest news on coral, unsurprisingly, is that it is facing massive bleaching, and you've read about Great Barrier Reef, and reefs are dying, corals dying, etc. Do you tend to lead with tourism-centric conversations or people-centered? And will you return to DC? I know you've done some work with the House Sustainable Energy Environment Coalition. Do you spend your energy there anymore, or have you?
No, we try to find people who, our message is already well known, right? We don't need to argue with the US government or the Chinese government or the Indian government or the EU about the message of it. They know it by heart. If they had wanted to do something about it, they would have done it a long time ago.
Okay. So,
you know my situation, by the way. I'm happy. We'll be in Bonn next week. It'll be interesting to see what the US approach is as we prepare follow-up to Marrakesh, COP22 in Marrakesh, and COP23, the Fiji COP in Bonn. And we just listen. But you can see them hunker down and say, we're going to get a bashing here. Here they come. And we just talk past them because what's the use, right? When out there, because climate change, the negotiations is a government thing. That's true. Action on the ground is not. You're seeing in the economy, in the financial world, people are waking up. I was just reading something about asset management people. About 60% of them now are looking at climate risk and beginning. Not enough, not fast enough, but well, we'll take what we can get. So it's finding out who are the parts. Some of them are in academia. A lot of the stuff I do like this is actually with universities. I've done it with Pace Law University, I've done it with Yale. There's another one, I think went to Princeton or something like that. And talking to people who can come to us and talk to us about solutions on the ground, who can say, I know the person or a group or even private sector who may be able to help you out if you can identify the financing. And so it's that way. When we talk internationally, one South African broadcasting corporation called me and said, we want to talk about sea level rise and migration, which is a SIDS problem. I said, it's not a SIDS problem. He said, well, in Africa, it's a SIDS problem. I said, it's not a SIDS problem. I said, there's 93,000 people in Seychelles. We have mountains, yes, but we can't retreat to the mountains if our tourism and fisheries industries are destroyed. I said, there's 80 million people in Egypt. Half of it, 40 million are in the Nile Delta. They better be more worried about sea level rise than we should be. That's why I've always bring in New York City, Florida. Imagine king tides in Florida. We always thought it was a Pacific rim. Now it's in your face. So what we do is we target our message according to where we can get some value added. Not just nodding heads. There's more and more nodding heads even in the US. But people can say, exactly, we're developing a technology, we can help you with this, and I'm sorry about that. They say, if you're guilty about what that country is doing, fine with me. But come with solutions, things we can afford. And now Seychelles, for example, is considered a world leader, not just among the small island states, but in the world on developing a blue economy approach, which is an integrated approach of sustainable development and climate, because in small islands there cannot be sustainable development without climate action. The two go together, otherwise you won't have an island to develop. And we're looking, and what we found is you attract attention. There are people out there who want a positive narrative. There are governments out there who are across the table from us in the negotiations, who when we approach them, come and help us out. I mean, China and India are helping us out with our transition to renewable energy, as is Germany. Because they say they're the small island state amongst the weakest. They're not out there complaining. We stopped talking about victims. We are now incubators of solutions. You get on board our boat, or this boat is going to continue sailing, whatever the rising waters do.
That's great. What a great lesson learned, where the ambassador is not spending energy. I'm thinking of all my peers in this space in New York City and DC that are spending a lot of energy fighting that litany that I referenced. And while we do need people fighting that good fight, his energy is entirely spent on the workaround, on solutions, on what's working, and people are clearly coming forth. And the positive narrative there is just very different, diametrically opposed from this negative narrative that is dominating a lot of the media space. I want to turn to John and Valerie now. So John, curious two things. One, for CNN, you went to Marshall Islands. Your return, I'm curious if it got what you wanted it to get in terms of some kind of communication to your readership and viewership that gave you the impression that it was a worthwhile trip. So I'm curious in your return from that experience, and if it keeps giving, if people respond, because I know it's on your homepage still. And then secondly, he's got some really interesting quotes in some of his recent articles, and you've gravitated towards this question that was asked by an anchor on Fox News to Scott Pruitt, who's our EPA administrator. Well, what if you're wrong? And so John explored that question, resonated with that question. I'm curious some of your thinking on that. And then also in one of your articles, our Secretary of Interior, Brian Zink, saying, well, you can't run a country on pixie dust and hope. So John is dealing with, and Valerie too, and I'll come to you in a second, dealing with these kind of conversations that are so, in quotes, that are so removed from the reality of Seychelles and what the ambassador was just talking about. Wondering how you square all that, because you know what's happening, and yet you're having to deal with these really trivial comments and powerful questions that aren't ultimately answered by the Scott Pruitts. And then to the Marshall Islands, when you came back from Marshall Islands, did it give you what you wanted to get?
Yeah, no, I didn't. I feel much more optimistic after having listened to you talk. I guess I'll represent like the negative media perspective slightly, but it is really frustrating if you've been to the front lines of climate change and met people who are living in the Marshall Islands, who are living in, I was in Madagascar last year talking with a remote island off of Madagascar, this community that's entirely dependent on a coral reef and the fish that it provides for their survival, and it's been bleaching, and they didn't know why, and it was this sort of mystery of the white coral, and they wondered if it was a curse that they'd caused. I mean, if you've been to these places and looked people in the eyes and confronted the realities that are already starting to play out, it is really hard to listen to an administration that just pretends that all of those people either don't exist, or that they're making those stories up, or that the science is all a hoax. It's a big disconnect. Like your first question about, was it worth it to go there? I mean, I completely think so, and I'm continually surprised by how surprised our readership is about various aspects of climate change. Like that story in the Marshall Islands, I told it first before it was on, CNN's main platforms on Snapchat, and I did it as a sort of it sounds gimmicky, but the idea was like disappearing stories from a disappearing country almost. And I wanted to capture little tidbits of this culture and people and language that are nothing about climate change, but just, in the context of these are things that could go away because of our actions, like not because of theirs. And partly because of that medium, which attracts a lot of younger people, I got just like tons of responses, a lot of like selfies of like outraged faces and like OMG emojis and stuff like that, because a lot of people didn't have any idea that sea level rise was a thing, that it was already happening, that there would be countries displaced. And I think the difference, one reason that the media often gravitates towards like the island states versus Miami or Virginia or Georgia, where I live, I mean, there are a lot of sea level rise stories to be told, is that it's this completely existential threat. Like your country, your language, your culture are tied to a piece of land. And if that land no longer exists, you're not only having to move inland to like, Orlando, you're faced with this question of like, where do I go at all? And I told the story of a family that's split between the Marshall Islands and Springdale, Arkansas, where some of them had, some of their family members had relocated, and increasingly, this one particular family, like the floods had scared them out of the Marshall Islands, and now half of them were living in Arkansas. So, I mean, it's something that's happening now, and I don't think that our readership or the American public understands the severity of that and the urgency of it and sort of the moral crisis that's going on. So I think it was definitely worthwhile in terms of the feedback I got on at least some people waking up to some small piece of that. I mean, you were talking about the reception that you often get where people are nodding their heads and say, okay, I know this problem, like I get where you're coming from, let's look for solutions. I think among the American public, there's a huge void of information, and there's a lot of misinformation, some of which has been very calculated and funded, and there's been a lot of attention paid to that. But now I'm really interested in part in this like information void, because I meet a lot of people who just don't know very much about climate change. If you ask them, I spent 2 weeks recently in a county in Utah that's very skeptical of climate science. And when I asked people there, and I was sort of on just a listening tour, like just to kind of try to understand where people's views come from. And when I would ask, like, okay, I know you don't agree with the scientists who say that we're causing warming. What is their argument? Like, what do you think the scientists are saying about this? Why are they so worked up about it? And people would say, oh, it's aerosol and hairspray, or oh, it's they would have theories that are like sort of related, but not on the nose as to what actually is even causing warming. So I think that I'm really interested right now in this breakdown in understanding about this topic that has been in the news for decades now, but for some reason, like the American public, it's still not getting across. So I guess that answers part of the first question. You mentioned the what if you're wrong question. I think that I was so happy that Fox did that interview, and I was so happy that they asked that question of Pruitt, because I think it's an apt one, and one that a lot of their viewership and mine, and like I said, the American public, that they need to hear is, think of it just in terms of a gamble, even if you don't want to jump on board with what all the climate scientists are saying. If there's some risk that they're right, what's the harm in doing something about it? And I'm curious, like, what, if you all have a sense of what percentage of the American public you would classify as climate skeptics, like, do you think it's, I don't know, does anyone have like a guess as to what it is?
I wouldn't be surprised if it was close to 50%, which is roughly the amount of people that supposedly, at least in this election, supported Trump.
Yeah, so he said about 50%, and that you're very close to right. Like, I think there's there's this group called the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, and they came out with these opinion maps like a month or so ago, maybe 6 weeks. And I think it was like 47% or something of Americans say either that climate change is natural or that they're not sure what's causing it, which I would classify all of that as, climate skepticism. There's broad support for things like, renewable energy funding. There's broad support for the Paris Agreement. But in terms of just understanding what is going on and why things like the Paris Agreement are important or why funding for renewable energy is so critical, there's this huge breakdown. I think there are all sorts of reasons for that, and I think there's a great danger right now with a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Washington being, this is fake, don't pay attention to it, no big deal, coal jobs are coming back. The percentage of climate skeptics will go up. As you mentioned, it's been going the other way, but there's a lot of evidence that public opinion tracks very closely with what elected officials are saying on this, and if those are your trusted sources of information, then I think there's a risk that more people buy into that. So I don't have any answers to any of this, but I like the approach of being super pragmatic and looking for the bright spots and looking for the solutions. If you look at the overall picture, though, there's a big disconnect on this issue, and I think it's partly on us in the media to try to solve that.
So every reporter I know who has been to region X, Y, or Z that is impacted by climate change comes back more convicted than ever that it's happening. Did that happen to you when you returned from Marshall Islands?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to be convicted that the science is real and to know it all in the abstract, but it's like, I mean, I always think of very specific people. Like when I was in Utah, like talking to climate skeptics, I found a lot of them to be fairly, like I said, I was on a listening tour and I was just trying to understand. So I wasn't trying to pass any judgment on them or how they had shaped these views. I just wanted to understand it. But in those conversations, like people kept popping into my mind who I'd met. Like I met a woman in the Marshall Islands who I was asking about the prospect of relocation because, I mean, it's highly, there's a big risk that that country will not exist in the future because of sea level rise. And there are other places that are definitely planning for that, like buying land in other islands, like trying to create like some sort of plan B strategy. And what she said really stuck with me, which is that she was almost offended that I would ask that question because her question, which is a much better one, is why aren't you doing anything to stop it? Like, we're not causing this. We can be a voice for change, but our emissions are not the problem here. And so, I mean, I really sympathize with that view, and I think of her in that conversation often, just as I think of the people I met who were depending on coral in Madagascar. In December, I was in Alaska, in Shishmaref, which is a village that voted in the hottest month of the hottest year on record last year to relocate because of warming. And they have absolutely no money or funding or they have sort of a strategy, but they don't have any money to enact it, to actually do that. But it's a community that said, we are unsafe in this location because of something that's out of our control. We would like to, it's the opposite of the Marshall Islands view. They want to proactively move, but there's really no help for a community that wants to do that, and even less prospect that there would be help under the current administration. So yeah, I think when you have those real life human interactions and think about what is really at stake and what could be lost in terms of language and culture and everything, it almost registers on a level that I can't personally relate to. Like a lot of us who live in cities, we are accustomed to moving around for work and jobs and whatever. We're less rooted in a place, but there are a lot of communities that are on the front lines of climate change that their entire identity is rooted in a place, like an entire way of life. Like Shishmaref is on this barrier island very near to the Arctic Circle, and their proposed relocation sites are inland. So they're, looking at essentially changing their subsistence lifestyle, the way they harvest seals, like, all sorts of things if they were to relocate. And that's kind of their best case scenario, is they're hoping for funding to move, and there's still a huge loss even if that were to occur. So I mean, this stuff gets really, I don't mean to be like a total like downer about all of it, but I think the moral urgency of that is important, and that's often, I think, lost among media consumers and the general public, that we are all connected to all those. Small window into like teleporting people there for a minute and helping them at least consider these places and people. And that's why I think it's really important just to talk about like cultural things and people as relatable humans, and not just, you know, and not just like the climate science. You need to know people who are impacted to really understand what's at stake.
And that's something we can do at NYU too. I'm just looking at the two powerful people in the room as it comes to CGA in terms of global field intensives that take students from NYU to these regions, some of which are in the United States, where climate refugees are real and they're being relocated, whether it's Louisiana or Alaska or Yemen or Syria. So the more we can orient potentially our GFIs in that direction will be helpful too. Valerie. So Valerie Volpici with Reuters wrote this week on yet another development. So Donald Trump has many an executive order, the most of any president. And this week's executive orders are oriented around making offshore drilling of gas and oil easier, and also rethinking how we've protected space in America, particularly monuments and the like. Probably so that industry can have a drilling field day, a mining field day in those protected spaces. She wrote on that recently, and you've been to coal country, you're writing about the way in which we're using or misusing some of our natural resources here in the States. To my question to you, when you asked what should I talk about, in your work with people on the ground, what is giving you hope?
What is giving me hope? Well, I think because what we've seen has been so dramatic, this kind of litany of executive orders and pronouncements, I think people are much more aware of what the existing climate policy is now that it is being stripped away. I think people are aware that EPA's Region 5 office in Chicago actually has a huge role to play. It deals with the Flint water remediation and cleanup of Superfund sites around some of these former industrial cities. A lot of the targets of the Trump administration's energy and climate policy affect some of the regions that very much voted in favor of him. So some of these Rust Belt towns have huge Superfund sites, and that's a big target in the EPA budget cut. The EPA would see, if that budget gets passed, which I don't think it will, but a 31% cut, Superfund would get a similar cut. This is the cleanup of former industrial sites. The Region 5 office of the EPA, where we've seen a lot of protests by employees. As I said, it oversees the cleanup of Flint water, Great Lakes restoration, and after this EPA budget was unveiled a few months ago, we saw some outcry from not only Democratic lawmakers in the region, but Republican lawmakers. Some of these states where the EPA is quite active, they don't have the funding to deal with some of these really vital environmental programs, and the EPA in those regions is really essential. They cannot do some of these major cleanups without federal help. And some of these offices are also job creators in the region. So we've seen a number of instances where it is those states where there's been most support are getting hardest hit by some of the environmental programs. And I think people haven't been aware of that until it's kind of all laid out there in a kind of a list of one after the other. So.
Are you glad to be in DC?
Am I glad to be in DC? I am
I mean,
glad
does
to
it
be.
feel good, like, hey, I'm fighting the fight, I'm reporting out, or is it overwhelming?
I've never been busier. The editors have never been more interested in this story. And as I said, it's
That's good.
when people, when laws are being dismantled or programs are being defunded, people start paying attention to them for the first time in some cases. So I think more people now probably know what the Clean Power Plan is than they did when President Obama proposed it a couple of years ago. So I think there's definitely a heightened awareness, and every time I leave DC and I talk to people, everybody wants to know what's happening in DC and what it's like, and as you just have. And yeah, it's strange. It is. It's been a very interesting couple of months, but I think that everybody is very engaged, and I think people are much more informed in a way, just because I think, yeah, I think that people are paying more attention to especially to this. I've been really surprised about how our editors in New York are just, they want more stories on energy and environment, so that's positive. That's something to, yes.
Do you ever get tired of more news out this week by PNAS, Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, that connected extreme weather to climate change? So 85% of all heat-related record setting, so imagine heat wave X or hot weather Y, 85% of it can now be connected to climate change. Do you, John and Valerie, do you ever get tired of trying to report out those facts, feeling like it's falling on a largely deaf audience?
In terms of weather events in particular?
Yeah, I mean, do you find yourself gravitating more towards, to the ambassador's point, solutions, what's happening on the ground, reality on the ground? Is that what you two prefer? And do you feel like issuing the latest release on fact Y or Z related to climate change just isn't hitting porous ground? It's just, it's landing on impervious.
I mean, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I don't have an answer for it, but is I'm trying to, when you're writing or producing a video story or whatever, you're always like producing it for someone, for some audience, and I honestly think that most of my stories in the last couple of years have been for people who already believe that climate change is real and is a problem, and that a story about coral bleaching in Madagascar or about a village in Alaska doesn't matter to you if you don't think that's a problem. If you don't think that all of us are causing that. You know what I mean? Like, otherwise it just is like, okay, there are extreme weather things that happen all the time, like things are fluctuating, like whatever, that's sad. I'm saying it's easy for people to say that. And like, honestly, there are a lot of issues that demand people's attention. And so if you're not making those connections, then it's not working. So I've been thinking a lot about how to write specifically to a skeptical audience about climate change. And I feel like CNN has a responsibility in that sense because we reach such a broad cross-section of the country, even though we've been labeled whatever by the administration. I think our audience is still very broad and politically diverse. And so, I mean, I take that really seriously, and I don't have the answers, but just thinking about that has changed the way I write in some occasions. I mean, I think that it's easy to get sort of almost too flip about the administration's actions and to write about them from the perspective of someone who would think that they're outrageous, which if you're concerned about climate change, you could draw that conclusion fairly easily. But if that can come across in the production in a way that you are shutting out like the very people who most need to be hearing about these stories and reading about them. And I think talking about the fact that the weather is changing and that we are changing it is important. I think meteorologists need to start working that into the way that they talk about, not meteorologists necessarily, but the way we talk about weather stories is like when there is a climate connection or implication, like we need to be saying that. And I don't think that message has gotten through to the public yet, how much we know about our fingerprints on the weather. And like that, report was another indication that this is real and this is now, we need to pay attention to it. There's always the risk of exaggerating it and making it seem like every weather event is entirely our fault, which is not the case either. So it's a tricky thing, but I think, you know, a lot of us in the media after this election are really thinking about how to communicate more broadly, and that's like sort of a personal challenge for me, and that's one reason I spent so much time recently in like firmly skeptic territory to try to understand where people are coming from. I think there's a lot of like middle ground in this Venn diagram, and you mentioned like renewable energy, like there's broad support for pushing forward with wind and solar power, even in, you know, fossil fuel territory. It's shown in the polling. People are in favor of clean air. This administration says clean air and clean water all the time, but you have to like actually, you know, look at what the policies are going to do in those regards. So I think it's about looking for that middle space, the stuff that doesn't always say climate change, which can be an off-putting and overly like politicized term. But I'm very in favor of still being upfront about, you know, the fact that we're warming the planet is why some of these issues matter so much. But rethinking how we talk about it and in what tone, so that it reaches people. And I think some of that basic explaining needs to be redone, even if it seems like the media has done it a gajillion times, because like I said, there's still a lot of people who don't understand why scientists know that we're causing global warming.
Well, I was just thinking, I think something that's been very effective and I think always surprises people is, again, looking at states that either have supported President Trump or states that have sued, for example, the EPA to try to roll back regulations. And for example, we did a story where we contacted the biggest utilities in the 35 in the 25 states that sued the Obama administration over the Clean Power Plan, and we said, okay, are you going to start? We asked everyone the same question: do these new executive orders give you the green light to, you know, extend the life of this coal plant or to build a new coal plant? And the answer, I mean, overwhelmingly was no. These utilities are carrying on with kind of a decarbonization. The pressure is coming from shareholders. It's coming from their long-term planning. They don't know that there'll be a Trump administration in 4 years. It's coming from public demand and from costs. The market is driving the price of natural gas down. It's made renewables cheaper. And these executive orders have not done anything to change it. And I think that surprises people, because it's not that, you know, Trump issues this executive order and says we're going to open up, we're going to lift the moratorium on leasing coal on federal land. That doesn't mean that necessarily companies are going to do it. It's like there's no demand for that. Just as utilities are not going to upend and start burning coal again.
And so are you interested in highlighting that disconnect?
Yes,
Okay.
because I think that always, I think it seems obvious to us at the time, but I think it surprises people.
Yeah.
I think people are looking for this kind of knee-jerk response by industry, and I think like a variety of businesses, utilities, corporations, I think they're all moving in. They're moving in a certain direction, which is not a kind of knee-jerk step backwards.
Let's take some questions from the audience. And Delane, since you're here, I know you gave me a question in class, but you might as well ask it since you're
I have a
here.
different question now.
Oh, great, different questions, perfect. So let's start with you and then I'll come over to you.
Hi, thank you. So I'm curious kind of about the intersection of climate change with other social and political issues that are maybe more visible or just on people's radar a little bit more. And I'm wondering what opportunities you see or in what ways you as reporters are reframing environmental issues to connect other political issues that people are maybe more motivated by. For example, DAPL and indigenous rights, or using the term climate refugees and connecting that to the immigration conversation in the U.S. So if you could just speak to that nexus. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Delane. And let's take two more over here, and then we'll answer the 3 questions. So Jen, why don't you go first? Or whoever, it's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a lovely discussion. I'm hearing, you know, people like one speaker will talk about people who were making progress and they see it and the disconnect and that kind of thing. And I'm hearing in other speakers, you know, things are really kind of awful because how do we get people to really understand the problem and the magnitude of it all, blah, blah, blah. I think there are pockets of different people with different beliefs, and that's very important. If you talk to, climate change adherents like myself, sure, Trump has only ignited, my energy to fight for this. But his supporters will say, how do you know? And they'll play the same game as Big Pharma or Big Tobacco did. They just reverse the burden on you to prove it. And so there was a question that was dropped, what if you're wrong? But it wasn't answered by anyone, and I really would love to know how Pruitt or any of these people would answer that question.
All right, great, thank you. Jen?
Yes, hi. We're talking about the importance of the engagement of people nowadays about climate change and environmental issues, and I was thinking about the Millennium Development Goals in, I think, 2008, and I remember that it was like a document, but it didn't make a lot of things between us, the people around, and then I jumped into the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN climate change meetings and everything. So I was wondering, how do you perceive the work of the role of media partnerships to promote climate change and environmental issues between us, civil society, and people?
Great, let's take those three and then we'll continue on. Ambassador, do you want to answer that question by Jen?
Yes, in fact, I'd like to answer both of them, and it's
Great.
also linked to what's been happening there. The conversation that's been going on domestically, we as islanders can't afford to be involved in this. There is an awakening that's happening in the US. We've been arguing until we're blue in the face, right? So we listen, we are interested. By the way, thank you for the media for doing all the work. Someone has to do it, and we're glad you're doing it. By the way, I used to be a stringer, quite a stringer. In another life, don't ask me
And
how
she was
far.
in Seychelles this year.
I would like to be the Reuters translation.
And the news about climate change out there that I track is the more depressing one. Is every day you see there's another finding, another scientific report. It's worse than we thought. I just read another one in the Arctic. It's worse than we thought. What is it going to do to sea level rise? Right? That's the one I track. I keep an eye. And in this debate that's going on in the US, we identify who we're going to approach. That's where we come to the practical bit, in that if some senator doesn't believe in climate change, what am I going to do about it? And what can he do to help me anyway, right? But what's happening is other people are coming forward who weren't speaking about climate change and who can help people in the poor world, in the island. And what you're saying is true. In Seychelles and the islands, you will not hear us talking about climate change. For us, climate change is a development issue. It's a health issue. It's a population issue. And there's a lot of talk about integrating mainstreaming climate into overall development planning with multi-stakeholders, youth, women, and so that you get the whole population talking about it. So that what you need is a change in lifestyle and a change in the way you do things. Not that when I wake up this morning, I'm going to do this, and this is climate change. No, that's not climate change. You're looking for ways to improve your population. Each time I go home, I just look at the beach, I can see it from a month, 2 months ago, I can see the changes. I can't afford to let that get me down. I cannot afford to be discouraged. My people depend on me to go out there and do this sort of work. So, and because there are so few of us amongst the islands, in fact, you're very privileged to meet islanders. There's so few of us. So, and the issues you're raising, everywhere someone raises an issue, we try and see, is there a climate, environmental angle? After all, Seychelles' economy depends on marine-based tourism and fisheries, both of which depend entirely on the treatment of the environment, not just climate change, it's coastal degradation, it's dying coral reefs, etc. It's become part of our DNA. So we listen to what's going on in the USA. I didn't think I would be that interested, but I find it fascinating. But I'm there, it's going through a sieve. I'm like a coral reef that's filtering the ocean and saying, what did that one say? Oh, that one is, oh, okay. What do you expect? And trying to find out the people. We need you to come and get depressed in Seychelles or Marshall Islands. Please come down. I'm sorry if when you get there, I'm not that depressed. But we need you to fire up and say, what are you doing to these people? People ask me, Ronnie, how come you aren't this smile so much, considering what you're going through? And you look at pictures on CNN after there's been a hurricane. First 2 days, 3 days, you see long faces. By the 4th day, even if food hasn't arrived, you see the smiles coming. And I said, look, I'm based in New York. That's the way our therapy. Smiling through adversity is much cheaper than seeing a therapist in New York. I'm sure you. So, and if we didn't smile, we would cry so much we would raise sea level. It's
So many quotable quotes right now. I want to tweet it later.
And when the objectives I do this, people say, how can you not help these people? If I expected them to be complaining and whining, and you will find complaining. In fact, you'll find the poorer the people, the stronger they are, but because it's more than just climate. It's a question of feeding the child. It's a question of jobs on the reef and that sort of thing. But the more you educate your own people, you start thinking the way I do. I know what's happened to my coral reefs. Marshall Islands is too late to save them. Kiribati, it's too late to save them. Maldives, too late to save them. Tuvalu, too late to save them. There's nothing we can do to save them. What are we going to do about it? Should we complain? We can't. Trying to make people feel guilty worked for a while and then they tuned out. It's like aid fatigue, or starvation in Ethiopia worked for a while and now people, they can't even raise the money. So that's why we're taking these new approaches. We need these different conversations going on. We need outraged Americans going on, talking about it, because every little bit helps us. We need that conversation, and through that conversation, a lot of information is coming out that we can use, that is relevant to Seychelles. Now, finally, we're getting the scientists marching. Oh, we're cheering from the rafters. But we've been using climate science. I mean, the small island developing states, our position in climate change has always been based purely on science. That's why we came out of 1.5 and rejected 2 degrees. Before there was an agreement on 2 degrees, we said we didn't want it, right? Now 1.5 is not enough. But people use us as the moral conscience of the climate negotiations. They look to us, partly because of our own people and partly because of other nations looking at us. We can't look as if we're giving up. Because the day we give up, everybody else falls into line. So we know where they're, there's one of my favorite quotes. Even if the oceans rise and cover us, when the bubbles rise to a certain extent, pop, you still hear us protesting. We just refuse and we cannot. But that also inspires the sort of people we identify to help us. They say, can this help you? I mean, is this any good to you? We say, yes, let's go and find the financing now. And the financing is not that easy. There's no such thing. Forget it. Climate finance doesn't exist. No country has a report which says, this is the climate finance, this is for poverty, and this is for HIV. It doesn't exist. It comes from the same government budget. Which is why now we're going outside of government into like the philanthropic community, where you have very rich foundations and trusts which focus on certain areas, and you try to open them. And what we're finding is more and more of them are now bringing the islands and putting them at the forefront of the things they're doing. So all this conversation is necessary, because what's coming out now By the time enough people in the US, I can understand why that is a problem. You're taking people out of their comfort zone. Someone once asked me, Ambassador, what do you think is going to change Americans' minds about climate change? And I said, simple, you haven't suffered enough. You haven't suffered. You haven't drowned enough. You haven't had enough homes battered. You don't have to, you haven't suffered. Until it comes, slaps you in the face, then you say, what's that? What happened? I understand that. I'm 10 years in New York. People are at home to tell me, Ron, it's time to come home. And I said, the day I come home, you know the fight is lost.
The study that the ambassador referred to also came out this week. It's called the SWEPA. I assume that the acronym is SWEPA, but Snow, Water, Ice, Permafrost in the Arctic.
Yeah.
And no surprise, climate change is impacting the Arctic faster than expected. So if you are outraged and inspired to write, there's so much that you could write on this week and put it off the news. John and Valerie, do you want to see if you can answer any of the three? What if you're wrong? Other socio-economic, political messages?
I can talk
Yeah.
briefly about that. With DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, I think that coming after the Keystone fight, which is now back on the radar, but I think that has been really essential in kind of bringing attention to indigenous rights and bringing real unification amongst the 500 plus tribes that are out there. And I mean, the interesting thing is you have a variety of tribes, some that are completely dependent on the potential exploitation of fossil fuels. There's some tribes kind of north of where the Standing Rock Sioux are located. There's one tribe in northern North Dakota that does want to lift restrictions on oil and gas drilling. They sit in the middle of the Bakken oil play, but they're still very supportive of the tribal sovereignty issue that the whole fight against the Dakota pipeline has raised. And I think we'll see it more and more in today's announcement about reviewing the National Monuments designation. This is really upsetting to the 5 tribes that were really instrumental in getting that monument designated. There's a 5-tribe council that is kind of governing that monument, and now they're outraged because the administration is seemingly kind of sidestepping the input. So the justification for undoing some of these monuments is that, no, we want the states to have more of a voice. But there has, in fact, been a very long process of tribal consultations and stakeholder consultations that have happened. So they felt that their concerns have been swept aside. So I think we'll see more activism coming from Native American tribes, and even though some are very interested in developing their fossil fuels that they might be sitting on top of, I think there is a general view that they should support each other's tribal sovereignty rights. And I think the renewed Keystone fight will be quite interesting, because right now the decision will be left up to the state of Nebraska, a 5-person commission that will decide whether or not to allow TransCanada to build the pipeline through the state. And you have a group of about 90 plus landowners, farmers and ranchers, that are saying, no, we need to stop this pipeline. It's cutting across their property. And they're going to focus, their strategy is to focus on eminent domain issues. So it's arguing that a Canadian company, a foreign company, should not be seizing American land for their own profit. And I think while a lot of them are, believers in climate change, I think they see the more effective argument in this case will be to focus on property rights, and as well water rights as well, because the pipeline would cross through the aquifer. So I think there are definitely areas where we'll see the convergence of movements, and that might be more effective for certain audiences.
That's a great example. John?
Yeah, on the linking other issues, I think we have to look for all ways to try to get conversations going on this. I went to There was that CDC conference on climate and health that was sort of abruptly and mysteriously canceled after Trump's election, and then Al Gore and some scientists put it back on in Atlanta, and I went to that. I mean, in their case, and I thought it was a strong one, is that the climate change is a public health issue, and that if you think of, you know, air pollution, just aside from climate change, that kills, you know, several million people per year. For some reason, we accept that as like an okay fact because of how we get our fuel, and that talking about it in those terms, as well as deaths related to heat waves, you know, and a host of other things that are expected to increase as the Earth gets warmer, that's something that resonates with people on like a more visceral, immediate level. What I worry about, I'm sorry, I'm always like the doom guy, but what I worry about is that even when you know those stats, it can seem like not an emergency. I mean, like the air quality in a lot of particularly like large cities in Asia is like abhorrent, but is, if not accepted, is like tolerated on this day-to-day level, where people adapt in all sorts of ways to try to get around it and try to make themselves as safe as possible. But it's definitely not changing fast enough given the scale of the risk. And I think it's always really interesting, we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, when you interview people or look at polling on like whether climate change or air pollution affects you personally, people are very often inclined to say, yeah, this is an issue. Like, okay, climate change is a big deal, air pollution, bad, not into it. But are you affected by air pollution? People even in some of the most polluted areas or the most climate vulnerable areas won't raise their hand and say like, yeah, that's hurting me. And so I think it's this, you know, it's been always the communication problem on climate change. It's this diffuse, slow-moving disaster. It is an emergency, but it doesn't feel like it to people right now. And I hope that what you're saying isn't true, that we have to get to this red alert emergency level in the United States for people to care. I mean, I think there already have been a lot of examples of natural disasters linked to climate change that should have rung those alarms. There was a Times piece on Sunday that mentioned this term that I hadn't heard before. They said they were calling it generational amnesia, which is this idea that climate change may never, even 50, 100 years in the future, feel like an emergency, like because our memories are so short and the generational turnover is such that the oldest of us might remember, you know, 80 years of change, and we start to accept whatever the new normal is as the new normal, and that's like maybe not okay, but it's something that is, and so we're going to deal with it. And I think like the challenge is somehow like, you know, peck away at that line of thinking and try to wake people up to the very direct cause-effect, you know, relationship that actually is going on. And then you mentioned the pockets of beliefs and the what if you're wrong question. I mean, I think the what if you're wrong question is one way to do that. It's hoping to chip away at someone who has a firm belief that you know, that we're not causing climate change, to think about this as like almost like a risk management type scenario. I mean, there is a former climate skeptic who I talked to who used to write a lot of the policy papers for Cato, and who changed his mind about climate change and is now an advocate for a carbon tax. And his thinking on it was changed by a cost-benefit analysis. Like, what are the costs of doing nothing? And you have to consider, if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, the disaster scenarios, which is that this is like an existential threat to our society, and those costs almost can't be estimated. And so if you're looking at it that way and thinking of it that way from a very, to your point, like a business-minded perspective, then that becomes like a very logical choice to hedge against those odds. And if you're thinking about it in a Wall Street way, then you might play it safe. So I mean, I think we're all looking for any ways to try to crack this. But I happen to believe that it's like really important what the American public, the global public, but right now the American public thinks about this issue. I mean, maybe it's like naive or overly idealistic, but I would hope that if there was a broader understanding of this issue amongst the public, that representatives wouldn't be able to get away with some of the statements that they've been making lately. And I think it is inspiring to see how much people have been standing up lately, the March for Science. I'm headed on a train to DC tonight so I can go to the climate march on Saturday, and I'm going to be hanging out with this group of young people who you all may have heard of, who are suing the Trump administration in federal court in Oregon over relative inaction on climate change, or it was over inaction on climate change under Obama. Now it's, I guess, counter action causing. But anyway, you know, it's a group of young people who are I think the youngest is maybe 9, suing the federal government, saying you're putting our future in jeopardy, and we have a constitutional right to things like property, which if you live in Florida, where the youngest kid in that suit does, is in serious jeopardy, especially if you look in the, you know, at the duration of his lifetime. So I think there are people standing up, and it is important to highlight those stories and not just the doom and gloom, but the context of, you know, the enormity of what's happening and how quickly we need to be moving in a clean energy direction. Even before Trump's election, what was, you know, stated in the Paris Agreement wasn't enough. So this is sort of extra layer of scary.
And if you are inspired or outraged to get more involved, please reach out to me. As my students know, I want us to be communicating to mainstream media all the time. So if you're looking for help or advice on your own articles, please reach out if they're climate related. I wish we could go on. We are out of time. Help me thank this amazing panel.